Welcome back to our discussion about the Roaring Twenties. Here's your intro.
New York City's Great White Way, Broadway. Throughout the 1920s, the nightlife here glittered. Bands played, liquor flowed, and everyone who was drinking it was breaking the law. In the first month of the new decade, the 18th Amendment became the law of the land. The sale and consumption of alcohol was now illegal.
There was prohibition, but oddly enough, nobody paid any attention to it.
We went to people's homes and served dreadful things called orange blossoms, which was gin and orange juice. Revolting. And bad gin at that.
Liquor was now sold behind closed doors in places called speakeasies. Proprietors took the risks and reaped the profits.
It was good money in them days. I was 15 years old. I was riding around with a Nash convertible. We had 4 speakeasies. One by the Daily News, one by the Daily Mirror. You had a peephole, you let him in. Okay. A guy had to explain who he was, and he'd show you an ID or something, and you let him in. You got to know it was like family after a while.
Every corner had a saloon on it. Of course, they were never raided by. The cops were a big part of that business too. People wanted to drink. It was a great game.
It became a dangerous game for the high-stakes players. Battles between rival gangs for control of illegal liquor territories riddled American cities with mushrooming murder rates. Prohibition's aim was to sweep liquor off the city streets. Now they were flooded with gangsters and guns.
I used to carry 2 persuaders myself. You had to have them, or else.
Prohibition and the general disregard which followed it was the perfect symbol for the 20s, a decade which was about crossing the line, smashing tradition, breaking boundaries. As modern America came of age in the 1920s, boundaries of all sorts, technological, geographical, and social, were shattered. The roar
Okay, when we left off, we had talked about bootleggers and speakeasies and some of the other terms that were used in the video that you just watched. So what we're going to do today is continue that discussion about prohibition and was it effective or not? I'm going to go back one slide because what I'm going to do in class, if you're in class, you're going to be looking at these slides and I'm going to be asking you to put in the chat, like, what message do these advertisements or these communications, because sometimes they're advertisements, sometimes they're posters, sometimes they're just postcards, what message is being sent about alcohol in these images? So just take a second. And if you're at home and you're just watching this recording, maybe you can push pause right now and just, like, before we start having conversation in class, get your own ideas down. So what is the message about alcohol that's being sent? Okay. Okay, some of the things that I'm hoping that I'll see in the chat have to do with kind of the message about beer not being very, beer being kind of sinful. So in this message where it says God will not be deceived and God is not to be mocked, and above it is this kind of advertisement for alcohol, it's almost like it's going against the will of God to consume alcohol, according to this advertisement. And up here, maybe some of you noted that this sign, this has these women, and these women are, not going to allow somebody who's drinking a lot to even touch them. And so maybe there's this message that, in order to obtain kind of a pure woman, a good woman, that you need to abstain from drinking alcohol. Down here on the bottom left, you see advertisements aimed at communicating to people that it's not good for the family, that if you're choosing to drink, that you're choosing something kind of selfish as opposed to what's good for the women and children of a society. You can see that same thing in this postcard down here, the shadow over the home, that this brewery is kind of like casting a dark shadow over the home where kids would be raised and women would be safe. On this far right, maybe you mentioned like patriotism. You can see that flag in the background, the saloon, or boys and girls, like you're picking between the two, right? It's an American issue. And if you're patriotic American, that you choose those boys and girls that are the next generation. Okay. So some of these advertisements are by the Anti-Saloon League. This one down here is from the Anti-Saloon League, and we're going to talk about them today. And we're also going to talk about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and you can see WCTU here. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union is actually in this picture as well, but they don't have their acronym there. So we're going to talk about those two organizations today and how they played a role in Prohibition. Okay, the only slide we're going to do in your notebooks today is this one, but there'll be a lot of kind of stats and statistics and extra ideas that you should put down in your notes. So this is picking up right where we left off, and it's continuing to talk about prohibition. So it's very likely that you have the prohibition experiment and like 2 letters already in your notes. So this will be a big C. And I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background behind alcohol consumption. So our nation has been a consumer of alcohol for a very long time. And in fact, in the early 1800s, long before the time period we're in class, which is the 1920s, the average male was consuming between 7 and 12 gallons of alcohol per year. So more than they are in the 20s and more than they are today. So used to be consuming even more alcohol, and in part in the like mid 1700s and early 1800s, when it was difficult to have a kind of clean water supply because water actually goes bad. It wasn't uncommon for kids and adults to drink like beer as a regular part of the meal because the fermentation process of the alcohol actually preserved the water quality, even though it's not just water now. It preserved the kind of safety of water, which is why, early explorers would stop and like brew more beer when they got into trouble because their water supplies were limited. So just so you know, in the early parts of our history, there was plenty of alcohol already being consumed. And in the 1880s and 1890s, just ahead of the time period that we're in class, there was a significant spike in immigration from Europe. And it just so happened that the immigrant groups that came into the country, some of them that came in some of the largest numbers, had a kind of a cultural practices that were tied to specific types of alcohol. So in the 1880s and 1890s, for example, we saw a large population of Irish come through the door. And the Irish culturally had a connection to whiskeys and things like that. We also saw a large population of Germans come through the door into America through Ellis Island. And those Germans had a strong cultural connection with beer. In fact, a lot of the breweries that are built up in the United States are actually built by German families initially, and some of them still controlled by German families today. So Italians that came through the door brought with them a tradition of wine consumption. So anyway, not only did we have a history of alcohol consumption at fairly high levels in our country already, but then the immigrant groups that came through the door in really large numbers in the 1880s and 90s came with their own kind of cultural tradition and practices that included some alcohol consumption as well. Okay, so throughout those time periods, we have had an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union at Work. They actually got started in like the 1840s in the United States, they worked strongly through the Civil War, which was in the 1860s. And then not only did the Women's Christian Temperance Union organize themselves as a group of women that were opposed to alcohol, but they also were also encouraging and advocating for their rights as women to be able to vote. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union is doing multiple things, but in our context, we're going to talk about them being advocates of prohibiting alcohol. The Women's Christian Temperance Union viewed this as kind of a moral issue, that it kept men especially, but some women too, from being good parents. It kept some of the money that would be coming into the household to be taking care of, your family. It would leave that outside of the household at a beer, at a saloon or a tavern or something like that. So you're spending money out there immorally. It kind of they thought that it might not be the right thing to do. And then in addition to that, people who drink too much sometimes come home and don't necessarily treat their families very well. So there was all sorts of reasons that the Women's Christian Temperance Union were opposed to alcohol. They are joined, however, it's not just the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but in World War I, which is what we just left behind in the last unit, there was something called the Anti-Saloon League that got formed. The Anti-Saloon League was actually led by a man, but also encouraged women to join. And the Anti-Saloon League was specifically advocating for alcohol to not be consumed during World War I, because a lot of alcohol gets firstly created by the use of grains. And during World War I, if you'll remember, there were all sorts of these programs trying to encourage people to eat fish and leave other types of meats, or to have wheatless days so that they could use the wheat to create foodstuffs for either soldiers or civilians overseas that didn't have access to enough food. So there was all sorts of encouraging of people to drink and eat particular things or not drink and eat particular things. And alcohol became a target for that. It was viewed as unpatriotic to drink alcohol, number one, because a lot of those breweries, remember, were German, and in World War I, we're fighting against Germany. And then secondly, because of the grain that's utilized to produce those alcohols, they wanted to preserve that grain for actual food. And so this movement emerged that sent powerful messages about, if you're a patriotic American during the wartime, you're not drinking alcohol. So the Anti-Saloon League was a big force during World War I. And actually, during World War I is when the 18th Amendment of the Constitution passed the Senate. So in August 19th of 1917, which you guys know is more than a year before the war ends, the 18th Amendment passes the Senate, and then it goes out. It's going to take about another 9 months for enough states to actually pass it along, agree to it, so that it's actually ratified as a law of the land. But anyway, even during World War I, that is happening. So far, so good, right? So you're probably thinking, so we banned alcohol, and what's the big problem? Well, it didn't go so well. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why not. So first of all, when the 18th Amendment of the Constitution passed and it prohibited alcohol throughout the land, there were all kinds of loopholes. So first of all, if you look back at the Prohibition definition, it says sale, transport, and it says sale, transport, and another word. Those are the things that are illegal. And individual people could still consume alcohol, and it wasn't subject to the same sort of fines and penalties. So it's kind of like personal use alcohol was okay. So you didn't get in as much trouble if you were just one person consuming a small amount of alcohol. So there was a little bit of a loophole. But in addition, churches could still use alcohol for sacramental wine, and pharmacies could still prescribe alcohol. So during this time period, alcohols were used, and they were doctors prescribed them to patients that had anxieties or that or that had chronic pain of some sort. And so you're talking about a bunch of World War I soldiers coming home with probably a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of, pain in their bodies. And doctors are writing prescriptions for alcohol, and that's considered socially acceptable to do. And so the number of pharmacies in some cities tripled because now people see that as a loophole to go ahead and continue to provide alcohol out to people who still wanted it. Up here on the top left, didn't come up when I wanted it to. I'll point it out when it does pop up. You'll see like a sacramental wine kind of display where different types of alcohols are still available. So personal consumption, not necessarily illegal. And prohibition fails for a variety of reasons. So first of all, there's all the loopholes. So alcohol consumption is still going on. Now, I will say that during the 1920s, during that prohibition time period, even though watching movies, it doesn't seem like the alcohol consumption decreases, it actually does. So alcohol consumption does go down. Some people abide by the law. Just because it looks like it's out there and available to all doesn't necessarily mean that everybody partakes. And so consumption does go down. However, there are lots of reasons that people lessened in their support for prohibition. One of them was just money. One of them just had to do with economics. So first of all, states and the federal government as well were taxing alcohol when it had been legal. And there's suggestions from the Economic Bureau of Research that the United States lost, in the year after prohibition, $11 billion in potential tax revenue, because once that alcohol was illegal, then it could not be taxed, right? So $11 billion in today's money of lost revenue. And then it actually cost the government to put people in place to enforce all the rules and laws that they were trying to put out there for the people to follow. So we lost tax revenue in a big way and added expenses in an additional way. And so money-wise, it was a loss all around. Secondly, the amount of loopholes allowed for alcohol consumption to continue, and legally so. So it was okay in some cases. So from a community standpoint, they still saw people consuming alcohol, and it seemed like kind of a flippant kind of disregard of the law. And the problem is that you might not think much about like disregarding a particular rule that you don't necessarily feel all that strongly about. But as soon as you're allowed to kind of disregard completely one rule that's in place, then it starts you down this path of, well, then maybe I don't have to follow this law or this law or this law either. So if you're going to allow your population to simply not abide by the law, then how do you draw a line between the laws you don't care if they follow and the rules that you care if they follow? So it became a dangerous situation for the federal government to maintain control if your people are going to disregard the law. In addition, they didn't hire enough agents to actually enforce the 18th Amendment, also called the Volstead Act. They hired about 1,500 federal employees, but there are thousands and thousands of miles of coastline. And that's to say nothing about the people that might have started brewing in their own kind of rural communities. So there weren't enough law enforcement to go around. And in fact, organized crime kind of rose up, and now they are going to become the organizers and the transporters of this alcohol. And now organized crime is making the money. In addition, organized crime outnumbered the law enforcement officers that were hired to try to enforce prohibition. And so they were really operating in a lose-lose situation because there weren't enough of them to go around to actually stop what had been happening. And then on top of that, organized crime starts to get territorial, and people like Bugs Moran and Al Capone are out there, and they're fighting over territory, and that leads to an increase in violence. And so one of the reasons that people stopped supporting prohibition is that they saw a lot of really violent gang activity out on the streets, and they hadn't seen it prior. And so they were thinking, hey, alcohol consumption might be dangerous to a society, but so is the machine guns that are going off like through our neighborhoods. And so that violent increase had some people saying, hey, wait a minute, organized crime has more power than our law enforcement right now, and that's a problem. In addition, the black market alcohol that was being created wasn't regulated by the government. There were no safety kind of mechanisms to oversee its production. And so some of that alcohol was actually more dangerous. And it actually killed more people because the quality of the alcohol and what was in it wasn't necessarily overseen by the federal government. So there's a lot of reasons that that prohibition isn't necessarily become as supported as we thought it might. So this is Carrie Nation is her name over here, this lady that just popped up. And she is part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, one of the more famous ladies to be part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she helped organize groups of people that kind of went in and went vigilante on saloons that refused to follow the law. She would go in supposedly with an axe. There's actually video clips and pictures of her carrying around an axe with other angry women, and they would march their way into a saloon that was supposedly a speakeasy that was selling alcohol illegally and just kind of go to town, not hacking people, but just hacking the place up and kind of destroying the alcohol in the process. So Carrie Nation, who, by the way, had been married originally to a man who drank too much, and her and her second husband kind of empowered her to do this advocacy work, but her first husband had not treated her very well because of his alcohol consumption, which is one of the reasons she got involved. This is the Anti-Saloon League, kind of trying to encourage that patriotism during World War I, like you're choosing between alcohol and, the welfare of your young men and women. And finally, up here, the sacramental wine picture is going to pop up, and you can see that, okay, kosher wine for sacramental purposes. Usually you'd have a small little sip in a Catholic ceremony at a certain very particular time when you're taking communion. And you can see that probably that jug is more than you need for communion. And usually communion happens inside of the church, not at home. So, Okay, last couple pieces today. In your own downtown community, this is Centralia in the 1920s, and the Olympic Club was already there, and the Olympic Club got shut down for being a speakeasy. So you have some speakeasies and bootleggers at work in your own community. The Oli Club's license got revoked for getting charged for violations with regards to liquor. And a couple other things that kind of don't make textbooks. It also became just kind of fashionable. If you were of a certain age, it became kind of fashionable to go out and drink at a speakeasy. And so there was that too, just kind of that peer pressure to belong and the fad, kind of that it was in style to go out and drink at a speakeasy. And the implication behind this political cartoon is just that organized crime had more money, more men, and more firepower than law enforcement. And so it created a losing situation for law enforcement. Okay. What you're going to do next is go into Google Classroom, and there is an assignment there asking you to look at Prohibition. There are going to be 2 articles. You're going to look at Prohibition and try to get, was the community in support? Look for numbers around that. What were some reasons that people supported repealing Prohibition? So why were people starting to turn against it and want to kind of legalize alcohol again? And then you're also going to look at contemporary articles around marijuana, because it's the same sort of thing that we're experiencing today, where people are saying, wait a second, if we legalize marijuana and tax it, we could use that money to do a whole lot of things. And so I want you to also look at an article from contemporary times about legalization of marijuana and see if there are any of the same arguments being used today as there were during the time period where we're starting to repeal prohibition. Okay, have a great day, and I will see you soon.